You probably have heard of the Underground Railroad movement that was covering this part of the country back in the 1830s and 40s, when the black people from the South were desperately trying to get up into Canada where they could be free. Of course, slavery was legal in this country, and it was an illegal thing they were doing. And anyone up north helping them to escape also were doing something very illegal, rather. And so they had to be hidden. Whenever the doctor and Miss Pamela, as she was always called because she was the young school teacher here, whenever a knock came at the door, usually, well, it might be at dawn, and they would open the door and they would find a man, sometimes with a wife, sometimes children, waiting, hoping and praying they could find security in the walls here while they were on their way to Canada. And the door was always open to them. Over the years, Miss Pamela estimated that from 1,000 to 1,500 black men, women, and children found shelter in this house on their way north. Now, of course, they came into Michigan, down most of them around the Cassopolis area, and sometimes were brought by wagon, horseback. Many times they walked and were brought to this house, and a knock brought security and food and a place to sleep and transportation to the next spot, which would be probably Battle Creek, where Erastus Hussey would find a place for them as they made their way on up into the Queen's Dominion, as Miss Pamela always called Canada. And we heard a knock here at the door, and it's very early in the morning. And as the doctor or Miss Pamela answers the door, this leads into his office, Zachariah Shugart from Cassopolis probably would be standing there with one or two or maybe three who are seeking shelter for the day, where they can sleep, where they can eat, where they can rest and move on. He takes them here into the office, and always there is something for the doctor to do. Perhaps there has been a shot in the leg or in the hip while they were escaping through Ohio or Indiana. That must be taken care of. Barefoot, of course, perhaps thorns in the feet. Naturally, toothaches. And he would take care of them while Miss Pamela, his wife, would be in the kitchen preparing food for them. And while they ate, she would be upstairs preparing a bed. Now, had there been rumors of slave hunters coming, she would have made a pallet in the crawl space where the wings had been added to the house. There were crawl spaces, and she would make pallets there where they could sleep. I doubt very much if those crawl spaces were ever used, because slave hunters never did arrive in Schoolcraft, but they were ready for them. And while they were eating, and she was getting the beds ready, then she would come down and do the dishes and let them sleep through the day. In the evening, the doctor would have made arrangements for them to be taken to Battle Creek. Erastus Hussey had, as they called it, an underground house where they would be protected. So we walk into the parlor, and I would like to sit on the fainting sofa. That was a very definite part of the furniture of this room when the doctor and his wife lived here. And I'm looking out the windows, the original windows that were in this house and put in, well, probably before the war between the states. Behind me, you will see a picture of the family. Dr. Thomas and Miss Pamela and their two children. Dr. Thomas comes from a very fine family down in the southern part of Ohio. They were Quakers. And he came to the little town of White Pigeon, right on the border of Michigan. Did they need a doctor? No, they didn't. They had, I believe it was Dr. Loomis who was there, and they didn't. But there was a great prairie, maybe 30 miles north, and people were moving in, and they didn't have a doctor. And they were coming down for theirs constantly. Why didn't he try? Well, he came to Prairie Run, and he found a welcome. Settlers were moving in, they were plowing the fields, and they had even started a tiny village called Schoolcraft. A store had been built, and a tavern house, as they call their hotel, right across the street from the store. There the doctor found a room, and he began his practice. And now we're sitting in the master bedroom. I think that when the doctor was designing his home, he planned a bedroom on all four corners. Of course, the one corner room would have been his office, and two small bedrooms upstairs for the children. And there were always plenty of people to use those beds because, of course, they had 4 children. Their one daughter died after she was married and had a child, but they raised their children here. And when you think of from 1,000 to 1,500 people sleeping here during the day, every spot might have been used, but on the other hand, with the rumor of slave hunters coming, they would have been in concealed spots where they wouldn't have been found so easily. I told you about the family, the father and the mother and the 2 children. They were heading north through Indiana and walking the roads during the dark hours of the night so they could see the star in the sky leading them to the Queen's Dominion. Sleeping during the day. However, when they were near the northern part of Indiana, they were overtaken by slave hunters. So the father kept himself very much in view of the men who were there with their guns to give his wife and his 2 small children a chance to hide in the woods. And he did receive bullets in his thigh and I believe in his leg, and he was captured. But the wife and the children had escaped and were hiding someplace in the woods. A short distance down the road, they stopped at an inn to eat, leaving the man, of course, out on the porch. And while he was sitting there, the small son of the landlord came out and he said, "Uncle, you're hurt. I see the blood, but there's the woods, and it's very, very close, and I don't see very well." And of course they were furious with anger when they came out and found their quarry gone. But the man, we don't have any record of his journey through the rest of Indiana, but can't you just imagine him walking down that road at night, calling his wife's name softly, and looking at the side of the road and maybe looking up to see if she had, the old story of tearing her skirt and putting it on. He had given up all hopes of finding her until he came to this house in Schoolcraft, and he found his wife and his 2 small children here taken care of. And of course the doctor took care of his wounds, pleaded with him to stay until all danger of infection was gone, but he was too eager to get his family to safety. And of course we don't know, but I have an idea that Miss Pamela mentioned them in her prayers a good many nights and wondering. No record, of course, was ever taken because it was illegal. And if the government had found these records, they could have been fined very heavily, as they were down in other areas close to the Indiana border. I found it very interesting that Miss Pamela was telling my neighbor, Mrs. Cox, who told me so many of the stories. Miss Pamela was telling her that after the war had ended, a young man, I believe his name was George Harris, stopped to see the doctor, a black man who had been given shelter in this house prior to the war between the states. And he said, "Doctor, I have an interesting story to tell you." He said, after one of the battles, a group of us who had escaped from slavery and gone up into Canada and then come down to fight. A group of us were sitting around a campfire down in Georgia one night, and we were sharing our experiences of how we had gotten up through freedom in the Queen's Dominion. And he said, would you believe it? Of the 8 who sat around the fire that night, 5 of them had found shelter in your home in Schoolcraft. And he said, Doctor, that's how you helped to win the war. Isn't that growth charming? It didn't belong to Miss Pamela, but can't you almost see her in that? And you know, I think I could see Candace Anderson in this dress too. Slim and pretty and charming with a beautiful voice, telling us about Pamela and all of the others who were so wonderful to the ones who were searching for the freedom that we know and love.
When Pamela Brown was 17 years old, she came to Michigan. Her destination was her brother's store in the little village of Schoolcraft. Later on, she became the very first school teacher in that town. And then she married a man named Nathan Thomas. Nathan Thomas was a Quaker and believed very strongly about the issue of slavery. And their house became a major station on the Underground Railroad. When Pamela was 76 years old, she was persuaded by her son and her daughter to write a small account of what this was like. What you're about to hear are all her words. She wrote these, describing what life was like in those days with her work on the Underground Railroad. When the air outside is crisp and still, we're sure to get a frost. Summer's been playing win or lose. I think tonight she's lost. God only knows that there are those traveling at such a cost when the winter here comes too soon. Well, I know that I am not prepared to face an early snow. Oh, I've got so much to do, but that's how it always goes. Some will come tonight upon the Underground Railroad by the light of this cold, clear moon. So Sally, watch the kettle and I'll go and tell the Browns the doctor says there's 15 coming in a town. I'll be needing extra cornmeal, blankets all around till they're on their way. The earliest light of day. It's true, I knew of the doctor's views when he took me as his bride. He didn't convince me right at first, but rest assured he tried. Many escaping slavery could find a place to hide at his rooms at the old hotel. And after we were married came a knock at the door, a woman advanced in years. She traveled alone, walking at night, all the way from Missouri. I'll never forget her, the story she told. They brought me right to tears. It's then that I knew all I could do to help her to get free. A year or so across the state, I was visiting my friend. I told her of the aid that we give and how it all has been. She said, although I'm glad they get free, I could never let them in. Not in my home, I just never could. Well, I told her hard as it might get, or dangerous it might be, there was a scripture she must know was always a help to me. It's as you've done unto the least, you've done it unto me. but I don't think she understood. There's some that are Christians who say they are Christians, who condemn what we're trying to do. They say we're breaking the law and harboring fugitives, but what would they have me do? Should I turn them away, give them back to the slave hunters, to bondage and beatings too? I could try not to notice them and call myself a Christian and know that it wouldn't be true. So Sally, watch the kettle and I'll go and tell the Browns. The doctor says there's 15 coming into town. I'll be me next to cornmeal, blankets all around, till they're on their way. The earliest light of day, the earliest light of day.
Many children, when you're talking about the Underground Railroad, will ask, why? What is it all about? Why did we have slavery in this country? Now when the covered wagons started heading westward, when they were up in the north, the fathers would take up land, a few acres, and they would have sons, and they would be able to take care of their land, take care of the crops, the corn, or whatever it chanced to be. But the people in the south, they would take up hundreds of acres when they planted their sugar cane, their cotton, and it was impossible. They didn't have enough sons or relatives or wives or even daughters to come and help them in the field. They had to hire people for their crops. Now, there just wasn't anybody there. There were Indians around, and some of the Indians found it very exciting when they heard that they were going to be paid with exciting things, maybe like guns or food or garments and so forth. And some of them would work for the people in the south. But it wasn't too long before they found that very unpleasant. For when they became tired, there weren't any trees where they could sit and rest for a while. And there were overseers who were there constantly, work, work, work. So the Indians slipped away. And at this time, there were boats coming into the harbor of the south, loaded with black men, sometimes women, and a few children. And the men in the south started going to the ports and buying their help, the people who could go out into the fields and do their harvesting for them. Now I have an idea from the records. There were many, many people in the south who were very kind to their slaves, who treated them gently and with thoughtfulness. And I'm really thinking of Dr. Thomas's great-grandmother, how her slaves refused to leave when she gave them their freedom. But the men would go down to the ports when those great ships would come in. Some needed field hands, and so they wanted only men. They didn't want the women, so the wives were pushed aside. Sometimes they were looking for help in the big kitchens in the mansions of the South. And they wanted the women, they didn't want the men, and so families were divided. And there were many tears among the black people. Of course, they had been stolen away from their homes. They hadn't come because they had wanted to. So families were divided. And it was a heartbreak time. These black men were used to being in the jungles. When they were tired, when the day was hot, all they had to do was just sit down under a tree, reach up and get their food perhaps from the tree, and work only when they desired. But that wasn't the way here in this country. There were long, long fields of corn and cotton to be picked. And if they stopped to rest for a while, there would be overseers with whips. Go on, the field must be finished by sundown. And there were overseers who were cruel and not only used their whips, but even used their guns, not only to intimidate, but actually to use. And it wasn't long before they had heard that way up to the north, a place that was right under the North Star, the bright star in the sky, there was freedom there. If they could get that far north, they were free. And many of the stronger young men slipped away at night, A few women tried, but not very many. Now there was a man by the name of Levi Coffin who lived close to the Ohio River. And he would take walks along the river very early in the morning. And he noticed, he couldn't believe the number of drowned bodies that he found at the edge of the river. Young men and older men who had tried to cross the river to get to the Queen's Dominion up into Canada and freedom. But they were stopped by the river. They didn't know how to swim. They couldn't get across, and yet they tried. And Levi, who hated slavery with all of his heart, he said, "That much I can do." And at dusk, each evening, he would go to the edge of the river there in Kentucky in his boat, perhaps a canoe, a rowboat, I don't know. And he would fill that boat and he would row these black men across the river and get them to the shore on the other side. And he would say, "Follow this road. You see it? Follow it as it goes. You will finally come to a house." And one of the houses he would describe was the Thomas home. And you will get food there. You will get shelter. You will get rest. And they will tell you where to go. And each night he would row so many of the young men across. And he thought this plan would work in other areas too, not just up through Ohio. And so he went into Indiana. His home was there. And so a line of this so-called underground movement was moving through Indiana. And he would go to different homes of the men that he knew, and he would say, "Will you be willing to take someone in who is trying to get to Canada and freedom?" And he made arrangements, did Levi Coffin, through Indiana, on up to Cassopolis, the edge of Michigan, and then on. And when he came to the village of Schoolcraft, he knew that Dr. Thomas was accustomed to helping the blacks. And it was in that way that Dr. Thomas agreed to open his home and give shelter during the day to all those who were heading northward. And the people who stopped here came primarily from Cassopolis. And the doctor would give them medical care and food and kindness and transportation to the next stop. And hundreds of men, women, and children took part in this movement that was started by Levi Coffin, the movement itself that's called the Underground. But throughout the years, there were many people who loved and understood and helped. Now, Dr. Thomas had seen it all of his life. His great-grandmother, his grandmother, his parents who were Quakers. His father always wore the Quaker costume to the end of his life. And so we do feel that we are a definite part of history here in Schoolcraft. And as we walk through the doors, we remember with love and understanding, this house is truly filled with love.